Welcome to the SSA UEI Professional Development Series. I want to welcome you all. Today we have a great presentation from the Network for College Success. Kate Pressler and Rhea Pretikin will be our experts today, talking about student voice and post-secondary success. But before we do that, we have a few housekeeping announcements. You've seen some of them in the chat already. I will start with, my name is Dwayne Davis. I'm the Executive Director of K-12 Education Initiatives at the University of Chicago. And these sessions were created, we started the idea really to support our local schools, but also to support our local community and our national community that are all dealing with COVID-19, a worldwide pandemic, dealing with racial injustice and social unrest in communities, and how do we do school and do the work we do with students and normally do in person? How do we do that work in a remote environment in a physically distant but socially connected way, and how we also do that with equity in mind, and that's a big part of the Network for College Success's work. So just wanted to give that preamble. Next, we have one last session. This is our penultimate session in this series. Tomorrow we have a session on pre-K to 3 literacy for parents and families and teachers in a remote learning environment. So if you're not personally in that workspace, but know people that are, it's at 3:30 tomorrow, and the links will be provided in the chat. All right, this session is a recorded session, so you should have heard that message already, so it will be recorded. And as a result of it being recorded, it can also be shared. So you will get an email with the recorded session as a person that's in the session, but also anybody that registered. We expect these to be shared around to be useful tools for school teams, school communities, and community organizations. Next, we are able to provide CPDUs for this. So if you're an educator in need of CPDUs, towards the end of the session, there'll be a survey. In that survey will be a link for you to say you need the proof that you attended, and you can get that proof. So look for that in the chat, and that'll be towards the end of the session. There's also closed captioning available. If you look at the bottom of your screen, next to the reactions button, we do have closed captioning for this session if it's necessary and needed. And the last thing is second to last thing is to thank the planning team, our planning team, starting with our leader, Dean Deb Gorman-Smith, the School of Social Service Administration, Adrian Talbot, Assistant Dean in SSA, Tanisha Legault-Washington, Co-Director of the UTEP program, Maggie Walsh, Co-Director of UChicago Impact, and myself. And I'd also like to thank Carmela and Sid, our tech and presentation team from SSA. And then lastly, I want to acknowledge the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation for supporting this work and supporting this effort to provide this free of charge, but also to provide the support to help schools and communities local to Chicago and also nationwide. And with that, I will hand it over to our fantastic presenters from the Network for College Success, Kate and Rhea.
Thanks so much, Dwayne. Thanks so much for this opportunity. We are happy to have you all here. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. My name is Rhea Pretikin, and I'm the lead post-secondary coach at the Network for College Success.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Pressler, post-secondary coach, also with the Network for College Success.
Okay. And, wait for Keisha to pull up the thank you. We could advance to the next one. Thank you. We'd like to start out with a reparations acknowledgement. The University of Chicago does not exist apart from Julia Leaks and the suffering of her family. It exists because of them. Between 1848 and 1857, the labor and capital that Stephen Douglas extracted from his slaves catapulted his political career and his personal fortune. Slavery provided Stephen Douglas with the financial security and economic power to donate 10 acres of land, which is valued at over $1.2 million in today's dollars, to start the University of Chicago in 1857. This founding endowment, drenched in the blood of enslaved African Americans, was leveraged by the University of Chicago to borrow more than $6 million in today's terms to build its Gothic campus, its institutional structures, its organizational framework, its vast donor network, and additional $4 million endowment before 1881. The University of Chicago owes its entire presence to its past with slavery. We'd also like to acknowledge the land that we are on. The University of Chicago is located on the traditional homelands of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux nations. Many other tribes call this area home. The region has long been a center for indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides here in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of the city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. You can advance to the next one. We want to welcome you all to this session on using student voice as data to improve the high school experience and post-secondary success. I'm going to launch a poll now to get an idea of who's in the room. Just go ahead and answer this question: what is your current role? So we can get an idea of who's here. Okay, looks like people have answered it. Would we be able to share the results here? Okay, it looks like we have a range of different roles here today, but wanted to give you all an idea as well of who is participating in this session right now. So it looks like we have all over the place, from community partners, higher ed staff, and teachers and counselors. Thank you for joining us. As Dwayne mentioned and Carmela mentioned in the chat, that we want to engage with you as much as we can. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat box. We have all of our team here. Lakeisha is helping us out here with the screen sharing, and also Carlos and Andrea, who are part of our post-sec team, are here today as well. So if you have questions, feel free to drop that in the chat, and we'll try to answer, engage with you in that way. All right. We can head to the next slide. We, in today's session, we plan to, is a poll still there? Mine, let me see. Actually, if you could go back to the intro to NCS, we just want to tell you a little bit about our story, the NCS story, our journey of where we've been and where we're going, and discuss some of the strategies we've implemented, including student voices data, motivational interviewing strategies, and a brief overview of our latest projects. And of course, we'll be sharing some of those resources and links and toolkits along the way. We'll also take you through a core values identification activity in this session. Okay, next slide is our mission, and the Network for College Success works to cultivate post-secondary readiness and success for all students by translating research into practice and supporting high school leaders to organize their schools for improvement and innovation. So we have our organizational equity stances, and based on the organizational identity, the skin we're in, and our collective experiences, we're committed to co-creating school environments that honor our young people's genius and work towards creating transformed student experiences. NCS is committed to leading from an understanding that transformation happens from the inside out. Before we ask others to engage in transformational experiences, we must first have engaged in that experience ourselves. So we at NCS also have our own personal equity stances, and Kate and I will share a line from our stances now. As a Filipino American, it is important for me to amplify melanated voices so that together we are no longer victims or the oppressed, but we are the ones who liberate ourselves and uncover our true greatness. Isang bagsak, when one falls, we all fall.
As a white woman, I commit to my own work and learning that will allow me to truly show up as an ally and accomplice in the fight for equality and racial justice, specifically for our Black and Latinx young people. To do this, I will take responsibilities for ways I have caused harm, be open to interruption and interrupting others, and intentionally work to unlearn those behaviors and embrace the emotions that come with this work.
So a little more about NCS. We're housed at the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. Professor Melissa Roderick authored the 2006 Potholes Report. And when the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research had just released Potholes on the Road to College, it became a seminal study on the college outcomes for CPS students. And at the time, CPS principals were coming to her looking for solutions and ways to translate that research into effective practices to improve student outcomes. Responding to the research, principals asked, now that we know the research, what do we do with it? And thus the NCS was founded. NCS has worked with CPS high schools since 2006, and we have worked nationally for over 4 years. Our approach, we cultivate learning communities and created a network of improvement. We focus on the capacity building for school teams and coaching for educators. So we work with the educators in our school partners, in our partner schools. So not so much with the young people, but more with the educators. And we engage our educators in engaging in the research, develop teams, distribute leadership, use data for improvement, and engage in network learning. So you can see here a kind of big picture of our work. You can see the red dots resembling the educational milestones in high school, which is begin high school, graduate high school, enroll in four-year college, and then graduate from four-year college. The blue dots are the leverage points. Get on track and choose a good college. All along the way, increasing GPA, B's or better, and ultimately leading to young adult success. So what do we hope you'll walk away with today? We have some learning objectives of exploring both student and adult mindsets, identity and values that impact our students' post-secondary opportunities and success. Want to explore data showing the students' responses to their high school experience and learn how the community of educators that we've been working with have been using that data to retool their approach over time. We're also gonna go over some of the techniques that we've used to gain insight into student experiences in high school, particularly related to post-secondary planning and success. So before we dive in, let's learn a little bit more about that journey of the NCS Counselor and Coach Collaborative.
Thanks, Ria. As Ria said, we have a Counselor and Coach Collaborative, better known as our CCC, which it's important to kind of understand the history of how this collaborative has evolved and how it has led to the focus of our work now. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So the CCC first was created back in 2010 when we brought together counselors from a diverse group of Chicago public high schools to form a network improvement community to collaboratively address the challenges that they were facing when supporting students in the college planning process. When the Potholes on the Road to College report came out, this is what ultimately helped the CCC formulate a call to action, which was shifting away from the opt-in college supports that were typically just for the most motivated students that sought them out, to instead developing a school-wide college-going culture that reached all students. So together, these counselors piloted, and counselors and coaches, I should say, piloted and refined changes to their existing post-secondary structures and supports. They developed post-secondary leadership teams that brought together a diverse group of educators to really work together to develop and manage the strategies that they were utilizing to reach all students in their college counseling efforts. And they directly supported students and parents with their FAFSA filing. They began systematically tracking students' college applications and really began to use that data to guide their support strategies and highlight the variation in outcomes that we were seeing across schools. Next slide, please. In the Potholes on the Road to College report, this was some data that was included that shows that only about 41% of graduates in CPS at that time, which granted this was, back in 2006, 2008 timeframe, that only about 41% of CPS graduates who aspired to complete a four-year college degree actually followed through with the necessary steps to eventually enroll in a four-year college degree after high school. So you can see when looking at this data, we started to ask, well, why is this number so low? And why do we see students fall off at each step along the process, from planning to attend to actually applying to getting accepted and eventually enrolling? You can see by the time only about 50% who originally aspired were actually accepted. And we also know that admission standards for colleges today are even more strict than they were back then, and so getting accepted is even harder today. So as we were looking at this and asking these questions as to why this was happening, we've argued, starting at this time and then has just been reinforced with a lot of the research that's come out since, that part of what's at stake in each of these key moments is the social capital that students have access to through their high schools. So what are the resources, the information, expertise, direct support that they can leverage through their relationships with adults in the high school community? Next slide, please. And all of that is what we refer to as social capital for a college-going culture. As I said before, as the CCC community was really shifting from providing opt-in post-secondary supports to thinking, how can we reach all students? And so building this college-going culture really became the focus, in knowing that, post-secondary knowledge is one of those ideas that covers a ton of ground, from knowing your options, how to apply and enroll, how to pay for college, and then how to navigate those institutions once you arrive there. And that this body of knowledge is enormous, it's scattered, there's no single resource or answer, to prepare a student for all of those different aspects. And thus, as a community, we really started to say this is about shifting adult mindsets, that preparing our students for post-secondary success is not just the responsibility of counselors, but really all the adults and the relationships that they have with their students in the school need to see this as part of their responsibility. So as a result, next slide, the problem of practice that we came up with as a community is, how do educators empower all students to turn their post-secondary aspirations into post-secondary success? Next slide. As we see from this data, there has been a lot of success in the last 10 years. We are reaching thousands of students. As we see, we've had tremendous gains around freshmen on track, graduation rates. But when we start to look at some of those typical post-secondary metrics in terms of college enrollment and graduation, while there has been some success, it's still not enough. So going on to the next slide, just to sum up kind of our overview of our journey from the last 10 years of how we got to that focus on the potholes of college success, and really, and had a lot of improvement, but saying there's still not enough success. We recognize that we've done a good job with a lot of the technical aspects, but now we're really focused on how can we support the identity development of our students through the post-secondary process. I'm going to hand it back over to Rhea, who's going to go into more detail about what we mean by a developmental approach to college and career readiness.
Right, we want to dive into applying a developmental approach to college and career readiness, but first we want to launch another poll to get a temperature check on how frequently do you capture student voice at your school or organization? Very frequently, very little, never, not applicable. Let's just get an idea of where everyone's at. Okay, it looks like a big chunk infrequently and very little so far. Frequently. Okay. Great, thanks for answering that. I know there was a question about accessing the survey that we used. Wasn't sure, Miguel, if you wanted to reference which survey you were talking about, but we'll be diving into a survey that we used with a focus group a little later, unless you want to drop that in the chat box there. Right, so in response to those early lessons, the CCC Theory of Action evolved to support not only the technical work necessary to drive improvement, but also the developmental work necessary to empower students to develop a college-going identity. So we tried lots of different things, and the CCC had begun to identify new strategies in line with this theory of action, including using motivational interviewing techniques with students, developing advisory curricula around academic mindsets, and collecting student voice, small groups or identified priority groups, values identification, storytelling, and counter narratives. And thinking about defining success, we talked about how we ultimately want to help young adults reach success. What does that mean? How do we think about young adult success? And how do young people envision and develop aspirations and goals that are consistent with other dimensions of their identity? How do they start to believe and develop expectations that are based on the beliefs that they can go to college and can succeed in college? So instead of asking ourselves whether college is the right thing to do, we want to consider the importance of adolescent development throughout high school. And how we think about that ultimately means supporting students in becoming successful young adults. And it's not really so much about a one-size-fits-all approach to college, but trying to understand the work of counselors and college career coaches and educators in the building in terms of its critical importance to social capital that Kate mentioned, for Black and Brown young people in terms of its developmental function. So we know that students experience at least 2 distinct developmental phases during high school. And this figure is taken from the Foundations for Young Adult Success Developmental Framework, and we'll add those links in as well. And when we think about college, we know that there's a ton of information on how to apply, kind of like all the college 101, the technical information to get into college. And if you look at the circle on the left in the green, knowledge and skills is really what would be heavy on a college 101, but mindsets is really salient at the early adolescent stage, which is ages 11 to 14, where young adults are experiencing messages connected to their mindsets. And there's a lot of emphasis on the beliefs and attitudes about oneself, the world, the interaction between the two. And academic mindsets are particularly important to the success in that transition into high school, that sense of belonging, relevance, and self-efficacy. And over on the middle adolescence circle here, that's ages 15 to 18, experiences and messages connected to students' values become more salient. Enduring often culturally defined beliefs about what is good, what's bad, what's important in my life, and that helps to provide an orientation towards one's desired future. Values are lasting beliefs which serve as broad guidelines for living and provide an orientation for the future. Values include both the moral conduct of how one goes about daily activities, long-term outcomes of for oneself, and just kind of knowing whether something is right or wrong for oneself. Tapping into those values helps to tap into that intrinsic motivation that we hope to see. And if we head to the next slide, we've always known that students want to go to college. This figure is taken from the potholes on the road to college. So, this is from 2006. And at that time, almost all CPS graduates hope to complete some form of post-secondary education, and their parents want them to attend college. You can see here the racial demographic breakdown, as well as the type of certificate or degree that one hoped to achieve. And what gets in the way? We know they want to go to college. What gets in the way of earning that college degree, or even just going to college? Oftentimes, it can be seen by educators as a lack of motivation on the part of the student, a lack of motivation to apply to college, lack of motivation to complete a scholarship application and complete all the necessary steps to get into college. I was a former high school counselor, and I heard that often, like, oh, they don't seem that motivated to just go to college or motivated to do well in high school. And it's often seen as a lack of motivation. You can hit the next slide, please. We think of motivation as a personal problem, but really it's developmental. Most of our cultural narratives about motivation make it out to be a personal problem. Like a successful person has a lot of motivation, and someone who's lazy may be unsuccessful, may be lacking that motivation. That's kind of the cultural narrative around that. And we know that motivation is a much more complex psychological phenomenon. So coming back to the idea of tapping into intrinsic motivation by tapping into values, we know that context matters enormously. Motivation varies situationally. Relationships are also really critical to understanding how and when young people are motivated, especially when it comes to overcoming hardships. So I've mentioned now a few times this idea of motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is a collaborative, goal-oriented style of communication, paying particular attention to the language of change. It's designed to strengthen personal motivation for and a commitment to a specific goal by eliciting and exploring the person's own reasons for change within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. So the MI spirit is about partnership, acceptance, evocation, compassion. And so how are we using MI? I'm going to call it MI for short. We've used student voice in empathy interviews. We've had some motivational interviewing groups at some of our partner schools, and we're bringing that student voice as data into our professional development spaces and tapping into student values and mindsets. Know that motivational interviewing is a strength-based approach. So at the beginning, I mentioned that we were going to take you through a core values identification activity. So we're going to take a few minutes here now to identify our core values. Having a sense of one's values is one of the core components of identity formation and can be used to guide the commitments young adults make to roles, beliefs, relationships as they try to find their place in the larger society. Values motivate how we engage with the world. Knowing and acting on core values is essential to being a resilient educator, and resilience is key to managing the continuous challenges that any educator faces. So we are going to take you through an abbreviated version of this activity. We're going to link the full activity and directions, and we'll share that in the chat box. And this is from one of our friends that we love to go to her PDs, Elena Aguilar. So we've linked that there from the Bright Morning team. So if you want to grab a paper and a pen, we're going to give you a few minutes to go through this list on this next slide. So this is not a full list of all the values that could possibly be out there, but we also didn't want to strain your eyes. So we have just placed enough at a large enough font that you can kind of get an idea of some of the values. Feel free to write in your own if you see that one of your values is missing, but just read through this list and on a piece of paper, write down 5 values that are most important to you. So we're going to give you a few minutes to read through it and write down 5 values. Hopefully you all had time to identify 5 values. So you have that written down. Now from that list of 5 values, we are going to cross off 2, leaving you with 3 values that are most important to you. I know that's hard to cross off any because you've found them important. to you, but we want you to be left with just 3 words there. Okay, so hopefully you have 3 words written in front of you. Those are most likely your core values. We like to ask you to, like, if you wrote it down on a Post-it or something, I like to have mine easily available to me. I have it in my planner, or keep it on your laptop, just to kind of remind yourself of those core values and see if they really fit in with who you are. And thinking about that list of core values, how did your energy shift as you were having to cross off 2 of those and just really having to narrow down 5 of those words? Are there values that show up for you that are more obvious when you're at work or when you're at home? And I realize that we ask this question usually when we're actually physically in a space, but now work is at home. But, you know, like thinking about when you're in these Zoom calls, do certain values show up more than when you're just hanging out with your family? And another question we wanted you to think about is bringing yourself back to your 14 to 18-year-old self. How different is this list of 3 values from your high school self? So maybe just type in the chat box if you think that these values would be totally different from your adolescent self, or they're pretty similar, maybe they've changed over time. Feel free to engage with us there. And as Dwayne mentioned, yeah, this is a great activity to use with young people. We've used it as kind of an icebreaker. We have these value cards where you can kind of organize them based on importance to you. And then we've also used them quite often with adults since we coach educators. And we've used them in our motivational interviewing groups, our small counseling groups as well. Different, similar. Yeah, I agree, Jocelyn. More individualistic values maybe when you're a teenager. Yeah, and it's hard to tell. And I think it's such a gift to be able to take young people through this kind of activity so they can identify their own values as a person and think about what is important to them. So again, we have linked the full activity. So this was just an abbreviated version, so feel free to use that with your teams, with young people, in whichever way you'd like. So I'm gonna hand it on over. But I just wanted us to think about too, like what our values are as an adult now, what they were as a young person, and knowing that our values and our voices still mattered when we were young people. We know that student voice is critical for co-creating the school communities that our young people deserve and want to see. So I'm gonna hand it over to Kate to talk more about student voice.
Thank you, Ria. Yeah, as many times as I've done that activity, it never gets easier to narrow it down. And when you look at the full activity, you actually start out with 10 and then narrow it down to 5 and a 3, and you hate to cross anything out because it's still a value, but just how important it is and just the reflection that goes into really identifying our values. I think it's always a powerful experience every time I kind of look at it from a different lens every time I've engaged with it. So all of that to being said, thinking about our values, but then as Ria said, also thinking about like our students' values, we knew that in collecting student voice, that's something that we see a lot of schools or organizations do. I think in our poll, we had close to 50% saying doing it frequently, and we've all seen it done frequently within the schools and organizations that we've worked with. But also we've realized that sometimes collecting that student voice, then you actually making it and turning it into usable data that actually impacts adult practices and how we are actually really using it to learn more about students, learn about their values, so that we're actually creating the conditions that are most supportive to them. So we're actually I'm going to tell you about a specific project that we took on last year to collect student voices data that really integrated a lot of these developmental approaches that Ria just talked about. So last year, as we said, there's 4 of us on the post-secondary team at NCS. And in our experiences, we work with 18 different schools, and all of us have come from working in schools. We all pretty well agreed that post-secondary as a term is commonly associated with primarily 12th grade and the tasks related to the college application process, and doesn't so often as span across grades 9 through 11 in as much depth. And we knew that the student experience for 9th graders transitioning into high school is often focused around behavior expectations and rules and regulations and logistics for how to navigate high school. So we thought if we really support our coachees and our CCC community in focusing on learning about the student experience starting in 9th grade, we can better equip our students to go on and be successful post high school. So this whole project started last year, as I said, with us deciding, okay, how can we collect student voices data and then support our counselors to actually use this data in reflecting on their own practices and making changes within how their school operates. So if you go on to the next slide, just a little bit about the methods of how we attacked this project, which kind of grew as we went along. But we decided to pilot this with 2 of our high schools, and we decided to focus specifically on our Black and Latinx males because when looking at the data, we saw that consistently across all of our schools, they were the students that were being least reached. So we determined if we could really narrow in and zero in on what is their experience and why, are they not having the same level of success as their peers, that if we could figure that out and better support them, that's going to better support all students. So we ended up with 54 males participating in focus groups that we conducted at each school in fall of last year. We did also have an online survey that they completed so that we could collect some quantitative data to correlate to the qualitative data that was actually collected during the focus groups. This became a very integrated project where we really had to rely on some of our other teams within NCS, specifically our data team, because as we said, collecting student voice is something that is done often, but then none of us, even having done it within our own experiences, really knew how to make meaning of that data and how to sort of code it and bring it together to really pull out making it a usable, actionable data. So they really helped us in developing a whole coding process. But then we were able to create a whole summary report of our findings, which then what we felt was pretty much one of the most important steps is we took those findings and that report back to the 9th grade teams at both of those schools, including counselors. The admin at both schools also were involved and shared our findings with them and really facilitated them through a reflection process that led to them developing some change ideas and thoughts on how they could adjust their practice based on what their students were telling them now that they had learned more about what their students valued and what was important to them. So in the next slide, just to show you that one of the things that we learned in developing this process is how crucial the actual questions that you ask when collecting student voice data is. It really will determine the types of responses you get. We had actually participated in collecting some student voice data at one of our other schools a few years ago, and it asked questions like, what suggestions do you have for students to be successful in the 2nd semester? And as we saw, the results of what students said in response to that type of question it was obviously answers that they had heard from adults or what they thought they should be saying about, oh, well, this is what I've been told, will make us be successful in the 2nd semester, but it didn't actually give the students to reflect upon like their own personal needs and what was working or wasn't working for them. So in developing our questions for our focus groups is when we really leaned on what we knew from motivational interviewing and values identification. And we really developed the questions to focus on identifying, what the students value, what motivates them, what is most important to them, and that it was really about their own experience and not about what we thought, was best for students. So going on to the next slide. When we collected all of this amazing student voice data from all of the young men, 3 key themes really emerged. They were that students really value student agency. The importance and adults in schools that help them to build that agency and put, priority on that, by giving them opportunities to be part of decision making about not only their own paths, but also their school experience. So really allowing them to be co-creators in their school experience. Another huge theme was around developmental relationships, which I'm going to go into in even more detail, but the relationships, the teachers and the adults in their schools that really valued, that really motivated them, were the ones that they had these developmental relationships with, the teachers and adults who took the time to get to know them, understand their experience, and valued them for who they were. And then lastly, post-secondary aspirations. Even though this was first semester freshman year, all of the young men, for the most part, had some sort of post-secondary aspirations, but they were very much grounded in their own values, and overwhelmingly, they were motivated by their families. So this was all really great information and learning, not just for the schools, but then even we as a team, it has really helped us to narrow down, well, what does our work need to focus on going forward? And just so you see, there are a few of the quotes from some of the boys were there on that last slide, which, so as I said, so in thinking about this and learning everything that we did from last year, this year we've said, okay, well, what are we going to do now with the schools that we're supporting? And we've decided that focusing on developmental relationships is really going to be the key lever that's going to have the biggest impact, and where we can support the most in terms of providing support to our counselors and coaches and our CCC community to together really learn about and practice how to form developmental relationships with our students. So to give you a little bit more context by what I mean by developmental relationships, this is something that the Search Institute is the premier organization that has really defined developmental relationships, has done in-depth research, and now is providing all kinds of great tools and resources in support of this work. So these are the 5 elements that have been identified as the 5 elements to developmental relationships. So one, when, care is expressed, where growth is challenged, support's provided, power is shared, and expansion of possibilities. A little bit more, if you go on to the next slide, according to the Search Institute, they said, relationships are developmental when young people discover who they are, develop abilities to shape their own lives, and learn how to engage with and contribute to the world around them. So if that's the impact of a developmental relationships, we just want to take a second to kind of reflect on that and think, well, how does having developmental relationships with adults in their school, how will that impact students' post-secondary planning and outcomes? So I wanted to open this up to the group. If anybody wanted to unmute themselves and share, we'd be happy to take a couple people, or feel free to share within the chat box. I believe that developmental relationships build trust. I'd agree. So how do we think that if we're helping students to discover who they are, shape their own lives, and engage and contribute to the world around them, how will that impact their post-secondary planning and outcomes? Any other thoughts, reflections on that? I think these relationships will allow students to feel comfortable to learn and feel motivated to guide their own lives according to their own goals, gives confidence to achieve. It's their own goals, they'll work towards it. Love it. Need to begin as soon as a young person hits the building. I may not believe this for me, but young people are most likely to listen, believe, if you trust. Yes, I can't read them all. So there's lots of great answers coming in now. Better informed decisions on the institutions they attend, and the major concentrations are generally interested in learning. Yep. Motivation. Yep, if an adult lectures, they'll ignore them and not feel understood or trusted. None of us like to feel misunderstood or not trusted. It's that I do that now, not just as a kid. Yeah, give students ideas about who they are and how they fit into the world. Exactly. Feel free to keep on, yeah, as Ria said, connecting their plans based on their own values, not as the values of the counselors. We hear that so often when talking to kids, you know, who are now graduating, like, why did you choose this school or this post-secondary path? And so often it's, well, because my counselor recommended it, or this teacher recommended it. And that's so often, yeah, their decisions are based on what others are telling them because they haven't taken the time to really, you know, delve into, you know, well, what is most important to me and how does my identity impact what I'm going to do post high school. So great, keep the conversation going. I am going to move on a little bit, but love the interaction going on. So also, just to continue to reinforce why we've decided as a team to really focus in on developmental relationships, if you go to the next slide, in addition, the research also talks about how student-teacher relationships can be catalytic for student motivation and success in school. I was just on a call earlier this morning at one of our schools where they were having a presentation, and a teacher said, well, what am I supposed to do if they're not motivated and if they don't care and they don't like what I'm reading? So often, as Ria said before, we have to stop thinking about motivation as a personal problem, but thinking about what do we need to do that having those relationships, as many of you said in the chat box, that's going to lead to the motivation. And that also, there's research that students with stronger relationships have higher grade point averages, feel connected to school, feel respected, and rate their instruction they receive as high quality. So again, it's also reinforcing the student outcomes that we do focus on. Then in the next slide, another reason why we thought this was so important, because as this quote says from the research, that middle school students who reported high levels of developmental relationships with teachers were 8 times more likely to stick with challenging tasks, enjoy working hard, and know it's okay to make mistakes when learning, compared to students with low levels of student-teacher relationship. We know we talk about that we want, you know, rigorous instruction for our students, that we want them to, you know how to persist, you know, through challenging tasks. And so it just shows that having those relationships really contributed to that. However, when we look at the next slide, we see that unfortunately, once students reach the high school, those relationships completely drop off in terms of what they report as relationships with adults in their building. So this shows that younger students are more likely than older students to report that their teachers care about them and push them to be their best, which are both aspects of developmental relationships. Among 12th graders, only 16% of students strongly agree that their teachers really care about them and push them to be their best. And as you can see here, not just 12th graders, starting at 9th grade, it's pretty flat all the way across the board. So all that to be said, that is why we as a team have decided we are doubling down on developmental relationships. And on the next slide, our theory of action for this year is that if we really can help all of our schools, so now we can't do our whole process ourselves at all of our schools. So we are committing to really helping all of our schools to develop their own systematic ways for collecting student voice and then using that data to help build the conditions for creating developmental relationships within their school, that's going to lead to the student outcomes that we're looking for, and that it will lead to students successfully transition into their post-secondary path of choice. So all that to be said, so yes, going forward this year, we, as I said, we are going to actually hope that all of our schools are collecting student voice, you know, and with what we learned in the process is what we hope to help and apply, and then also just really build the capacity of our counselors and coaches within our committee, with our community to really understand developmental relationships so they can support other adults and teams within their buildings for doing the same. So on the next slide, we definitely didn't want to leave you without tools, because certainly creating these types of relationships and understanding them is not something that is just easy for everyone. So these all come from the Search Institute, again, which I said is our primary go-to and just has so much good, there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. So these links, which are also be shared in the chat box, gives their whole developmental relationship framework. They have developed relationships check tool. It's an online survey that adults can use to really reflect on how they're doing with building relationships during remote learning. So this is something that we're definitely planning to use with our community this year. They also have a full checklist on how you can build developmental relationships during the COVID-19 crisis. And then lastly, it's the Search Institute's full research report called Relationships First, which also has some great resources embedded in it for, for teachers and adults and other staff in schools. And lastly, it's not in there, but literally today, they are coming out with a developmental relationships survey that is available at a cost. But that is something that if you or your school or organization really wanted to implement, so that is something that also has become available through them. So to wrap it up, before we move into questions, we want to launch one more poll. You guys already answered about how many of your schools or organizations collect student data, but now we want to hear how well you think your schools or organizations use it to actually inform adult practices and decision making. Couple more results coming in. All right, let's go ahead and show the results. So overwhelmingly somewhat well, which is what I would have predicted, that, yeah, collecting the student voice is one thing, but then figuring out how it's really being used and really being listened to as a way to inform practices and decision-making is something that I think there's still plenty of room to grow in. So thank you for sharing and kind of reflecting on your own schools and organizations and how you're incorporating student voice. Lastly, before we open up for questions, we did just want to make you aware that NCS has a lot of other great resources available on our website. We have an entire post-secondary success toolkit. We also have a freshman on track toolkit. So we're putting the links to our website, and those tools are also going to be put in the chat box and can be found on our website. That's open for anyone to use. So we've got about 6 more minutes. We'll go ahead and put our last slide on there that you can follow us on any of our multiple social medias, but we certainly want to open it up for any questions or clarifications before we sign out. And I think that we can even unmute people if someone had a question that they wanted to ask verbally and not in the chat box.
I'll just add, this is an open Q&A session, so we have about maybe 3 or 4 minutes. So if you want to ask a question, go ahead. And when we get to that 4:29 mark, we have a couple closing remarks, and then Carmela's already putting a survey for the CPDUs in there. So just wanted to put that out there. Also open Q&A for a few minutes.
Hey y'all, can you hear me? Well, thank you all for the presentation. Kate, that was a great job. It's great seeing you.
Hey, good to see you too.
I know you brought up that one of the like key things that you recommend is making sure that the survey questions are like well vetted and that they're well worded, or else we'd be sent in very different directions about what we think the student voice is telling us. But were there other like hurdles or obstacles that you saw, whether in preparing to meet with students or getting staff on board to do this? Because I could imagine we would all be on board to want to get student voice, but like how to do it or how to implement it and follow through would be, on my end would be the hardest part.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I forgot to mention that the counselors at both schools were hugely helpful in like pulling together the students and kind of handling the logistics. But we didn't want to put the extra work on the school staff to actually conduct the focus groups and collect all the data. So we as a team, and then even pulled in some of our fellow staff members, actually conducted it. And it did. it took like, I forget, at least 4 adults, because we tried to have 2 adults at least for every focus group, so that one person was asking the question, the other person was just scribing, you know, the responses as much as possible, because we really wanted to capture word for word. And then, as I said, the process for actually coding it and bringing it all together was time consuming. So we even got like some interns. So that's where we kind of like, it was a whole learning. There's certainly things we would do differently, but yes, it's also thinking about what is feasible, which is something that we'll really work with our schools this year to figure out. Like, it may not be that they're going to collect voice from all of their students, you know, starting out with a target group or something, because yeah, the process was, we learned just as much from the process as we did from the results, for sure. And I don't know if anyone else from the team wants to add anything.
Yeah, I think it really just, you know, as Kate mentioned earlier, one of the surveys given before was really like, how can you be successful in high school? And all the answers were so similar that it was clear that they were repeating what an adult had told them. Don't be late to class, do all your work, don't have a relationship. It was, you know, that's kind of like funny things, but maybe things that an adult would have told a young person, and really thinking about how could you get to know the student better and identify what their version of success is, what is important to them, and how do they think that they could do better in high school.
All right, well, we have one more question in the chat. Kate or Rhea, you want to take that one? That'll be our last question from May.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that was a learning for us too, because one of our schools that we worked with does have a high number of English language learners, and we realized that we were not prepared for that. And so that's one of our learnings going forward, is how do we account for, you know, is it one, when conducting whatever it is for collecting this invoice, do we need to have it in other languages? Or, you know, are there different questions that we need to differentiate the questions based on, you know, what some of the students' backgrounds and experiences are? Because again, you know, a student, as you said, coming from another country may need different, some more supports. And so how are we really capturing the different student experiences within a school?
Yeah, and definitely that trust part was a little harder too, because I don't know if maybe we weren't clear about like what the purpose of the focus group was, the need to be honest, and like knowing that it would be confidential and that their name would be anonymous. I think that going back, we would have spent more time on saying that, so that maybe they could have been more honest and open with us in those focus groups.
Right. Well, we probably have about 30 more seconds left. So we want to thank everyone for their attendance and attention and interaction in the chat in this session. We want to thank the Network for College Success, Lakeisha Pittman, for answering my email, Jackie Lemon and Sarah for partnering with us to kind of bring this together, and our presenters, Kate and Rhea, for today, and all of the presenters up to this point. Again, next session is tomorrow. It is a pre-K to third grade literacy remote learning session. So if you're interested in that or have colleagues that would be interested, please direct them to the SSA UEI website or the link that you use to get to this session. Carmela already added the survey into the chat for your CP to use if you're interested and need those. And again, everyone that registered for this session and attended will get a copy of the deck, a copy and a link to the video, which will be posted, and all of the sessions that we've done to this point. So 2 on trauma-informed, being trauma-informed in your practice, and having self-care, anti-racism, STEM across pre-K to 12, freshman on track, and now this session will all be collected on that same website for recording, for sharing, and for using in your schools, in your community programs, and with your other partners to think about this work. So I want to thank you again. Thank SSA, thank Dean Gorman-Smith, Deb Gorman-Smith, and thank the foundation for their support. Everybody be safe, be healthy, and have a great rest of the week. And for those that are CPS in Chicago or anyone that's starting school next week, good luck, Godspeed. We are all of us to work with schools and work and try to help schools and help kids and young people and families are here to be as useful and helpful as we can, but also be as caring as we can and understand all the things we're all going through as a wider community in our cities and across our nation. So just be safe, be healthy, and have a great rest of the week and weekend.